What was once a cautious pivot is now becoming policy. Canadian copper producers, smelters, and logistics firms aren't waiting for the U.S. to come to its senses. They've begun locking in long-term contracts with buyers in South Korea, Japan, and India. Government officials have even started quietly subsidizing port expansions along the Pacific coast to accommodate the increased flow of eastbound copper. This is more than just a response to a tariff. It's a structural shift in trade philosophy. For decades, Canadian trade policy was built around proximity and predictability with the United States. That assumption has crumbled. What used to be inevitable has become unwise. What used to be efficient is now viewed as strategically dangerous. Even the Canadian business community, historically averse to sudden change, is starting to view America as a risk market, not because of its consumers or capacity, but because of the instability at the top. One executive at a leading Canadian mining firm, speaking anonymously, described it this way: "It's not the market we distrust. It's the man in charge of the market. He governs through tantrums. You can't plan around tantrums."
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
The tariff ripple becomes a supply shock. As August approaches, the copper market is bracing for chaos. Contracts have been rewritten. Shipment dates moved up, inventories hoarded, and stockpiles shifted. Several U.S. copper-dependent manufacturers are now sounding the alarm. They're not just facing price increases. They're facing actual supply gaps. One major utility firm in Texas issued a statement warning that transformer orders will now be delayed by 8 to 12 weeks due to copper shortages. In New Jersey, a new electric bus project has been paused because suppliers can't guarantee stable copper costs. EV companies are now reevaluating their pricing models entirely. And in construction, it's carnage. Developers across California and the Southwest report that new apartment buildings could cost $20,000 to $50,000 more per unit as a direct result of the copper tariff. In a housing affordability crisis, that is a death sentence for expansion. Canada's $125 billion retaliation package looms. Meanwhile, Ottawa's countermeasures are loaded and ready. The $125 billion retaliatory tariff package, Canada's largest trade response in history, is sitting in Parliament awaiting formal activation. It targets everything from U.S. pharmaceuticals and processed food to semiconductors and farm equipment. Unlike Trump's tariffs, Canada's response is calculated, symmetrical, and explicitly designed to hurt vulnerable U.S. constituencies, particularly in battleground states. This is no coincidence. Canadian policymakers have learned from Trump's playbook, but they're executing it with surgical precision. If Trump wants to hit metals, Canada will hit medicine. If the U.S. disrupts electrical grids with raw material shortages, Canada will disrupt pharmacy shelves with finished goods tariffs. And they're doing it without fanfare. No podiums, no name-calling, just legal documentation and parliamentary procedure. This is how modern trade war looks. Spreadsheets, not shouting. U.S. political fallout begins to mount. The backlash at home is growing. Governors in key copper-consuming states, Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, have begun distancing themselves from the White House's trade policy. One Republican governor went so far as to call the copper tariff economic vandalism masquerading as nationalism. Within the Republican Party itself, Trump's grip remains strong, but cracks are showing. Business leaders and moderate conservatives are raising alarm bells, noting that every attempt to punish trade partners has ended up punishing domestic workers instead. And it's not just copper. This is part of a pattern. Trump's terror crusade has targeted steel, aluminum, solar panels, coffee, semiconductors, now copper, each time triggering blowback, higher costs, and a scramble to explain why economic hardship is somehow a patriotic sacrifice. The talking points are getting old, and Americans are getting tired of paying for them. Global investors are watching closely. The international financial world isn't ignoring this either. Credit rating agencies have issued warnings on U.S. industrial bonds tied to copper-intensive sectors. Canadian investment banks are offering new Asia pivot ETFs for clients betting on non-American trade routes. Hedge funds are pouring capital into Chilean and Peruvian mining operations, which now look poised to take a larger slice of the Asian copper market. America, once the gravitational center of North American trade, is slowly being circumnavigated. Even European companies are adjusting procurement strategies. Several German auto firms are now buying copper from Canadian producers through Rotterdam, bypassing U.S. suppliers entirely. The ripple isn't regional, it's global. Energy security and strategic minerals now at risk. Here's the part few in Washington seem to grasp. Copper isn't just a commodity, it's a strategic mineral. It is embedded in every critical system the modern world depends on. EVs, solar panels, wind turbines, power grids, water systems, medical equipment. To strangle its supply is to sabotage your own modernization. By imposing a 50% tariff, Trump has handed leverage to adversaries and alienated allies. China, now the world's largest copper processor, is watching gleefully. While the U.S. bickers with Canada and disrupts its own supply chain, Beijing is securing multi-decade copper contracts across Africa and South America. Canada, meanwhile, is shipping raw copper to Asian refiners, some of which eventually ends up in China's industrial stockpile. The irony writes itself. The silent cultural shift in Canada. Back in Canada, a deeper transformation is underway, one that transcends trade. There is a quiet cultural realignment unfolding in response to America's behavior. Once seen as a friendly big brother, the U.S. is now viewed more like an unstable ex. Unpredictable, unreliable, and increasingly irrelevant. Travel to the U.S. is down. Retailers are stocking fewer American goods. Cultural exports from Europe and Asia are rising. Canadian identity, long entangled with proximity to America, is standing up straighter. University students now study EU law with the same seriousness they once reserved for U.S. policy. Canadian tech firms are setting up regional HQs in Singapore and Lisbon, not San Francisco. And a new generation Canadian diplomat speaks Mandarin, Hindi, and Portuguese, not just English and French. It's not loud. It's not even angry. It's just different. And it's not going back. Will diplomacy prevail, or is this the new normal? The coming months will determine whether this rupture can be mended. Diplomatic channels remain open, but barely. U.S. trade envoys have quietly reached out to Canadian officials to reassess the situation, but no serious concessions are on the table yet. Ottawa has made it clear, unless the tariff is rolled back, retaliation will proceed. The larger question isn't just whether this particular fight can be de-escalated. It's whether the U.S., under Trump, is even capable of maintaining stable, respectful trade relationships anymore. Because if the answer is no, the world will keep adjusting without it. As the copper market convulses, supply chains reroute, and industries brace for impact, one thing is clear. Canada has moved on, and the United States, once the anchor of North American prosperity, now finds itself increasingly alone, adrift in a sea of self-inflicted chaos. The fallout from Trump's 50% copper tariff was immediate and devastating, not just to Canada, but to the very industries and workers Trump claimed to protect. American manufacturers found themselves scrambling for alternatives. Construction firms paused projects. Copper wiring became a luxury overnight. And the irony? The U.S. doesn't even produce enough copper to meet its own needs. This wasn't economic nationalism. It was economic sabotage, dressed up in patriotic sound bites and campaign slogans. In Canada, the response was surgical. No dramatic podium statements. No Twitter tirades. Just strategy. Ottawa activated what insiders referred to as the Iron Web, a contingency network of trade partners in East Asia and Europe that have been developed quietly over the past 5 years. Within 72 hours, over 35% of Canada's copper shipments originally destined for U.S. ports were rerouted to Tokyo, Busan, and Rotterdam. South Korea's copper processors reportedly offered Canada a 5-year no-tariff contract to secure future shipments. This wasn't a retreat. It was a pivot, clean, efficient, and brutally effective. For Trump, this wasn't supposed to happen. He expected submission. He expected Ottawa to fold, maybe beg for a rollback. Instead, what he got was silence and an avalanche of retaliatory moves. The Canadian government, through executive orders, suspended fast-track border certifications for over 60 U.S. tech firms. Chip makers and electric vehicle manufacturers that depended on rare Canadian earths suddenly found themselves out in the cold. What Trump had billed as a great victory for American industry had turned into a self-inflicted embargo. Farmers in Iowa, Michigan, and Wisconsin, already battered by years of trade uncertainty, now faced the loss of their Canadian export contracts. In Saskatchewan and Alberta, Canadian wheat and beef producers were being wooed by Southeast Asian buyers hungry to lock in multi-year food security deals. Within weeks, Canadian agriculture was exporting more to Vietnam and Indonesia than to the entire U.S. Midwest. Trump's move had just accelerated the redirection of trade flows across an entire continent. Then came the consumer blowback. Prices surged. The cost of rewiring a single mid-sized commercial building in Phoenix went up by $11,000. EV manufacturers hiked their sticker prices by 8 to 12%, pricing many American families out of what had once been their affordable entry into clean transportation. Even basic utilities began to feel the pinch, as copper-dependent grid upgrades in Texas, Arizona, and Nevada stalled due to skyrocketing material costs. Public backlash began to mount. At a town hall in Erie, Pennsylvania, a Trump voter asked a Republican congressman why their utility bills were up 18% and copper parts were on backorder for months. There was no good answer, because there was no good reason. Only a political strategy built on confrontation, not comprehension. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Mark Carney emerged from the shadows. Calm, articulate, and armed with data, he gave a short but pointed national address. Canada does not escalate. We adapt, and we will not allow our economy to be hostage to erratic policies from abroad. The message was clear, not just to Canadians, but to the world. Canada was done playing second fiddle. In Brussels, Carney and EU leadership formalized a new trilateral minerals corridor linking Canada, the European Union, and Japan. The deal created a tariff-free copper and lithium network focused on shared environmental standards and reciprocal market access. In return, the EU agreed to fast-track Canadian-made components into their EV supply chains, effectively replacing U.S. suppliers. The U.S. wasn't being isolated by accident. It was being replaced systematically and without apology. American allies started to notice. Australia, reeling from stalled U.S. trade negotiations, reopened exploratory talks with Canadian mining consortiums. Mexico, once seen as a junior partner in North American trade, began floating trial shipment deals with Canadian rail carriers for copper and aluminum. Trump had overplayed his hand, and the continent was realigning around the vacuum he created. Even China made its move. State-backed processors reached out to Canadian firms with massive purchase orders. Carney, while skeptical, allowed exploratory discussions. Not because he welcomed Chinese alignment, but because he knew leverage is the currency of survival. In back channels, the message was simple. Canada will sell where it's respected, and respect wasn't coming from Washington anymore. In Washington, chaos reigned. Congressional Republicans were split. Some, blindly loyal, defended the tariffs as bold bargaining. Others panicked. Senators from Maine and Arizona pleaded with the administration to consider a rollback. American Copper and Alloy, one of the largest processors in the Midwest, announced it would relocate part of its operations to Ontario, citing better supply reliability. Within days, they weren't alone. At least 4 U.S. manufacturing companies filed relocation paperwork with Canadian provinces, hoping to avoid the inflationary pressures sparked by the tariff war. Labor unions, once aligned with Trump on trade protectionism, began breaking rank. The United Steelworkers of America released a scathing internal memo. Tariffs without foresight hurt American labor more than they help. This isn't protection. This is policy malpractice. Strike threats began circulating at plants unable to meet production targets due to copper shortages. Trump had promised jobs. What he delivered was chaos. On the other side of the border, Canada's economic indicators quietly ticked upward. While the U.S. faced stagflation, Canadian exporters reported modest growth in Asia-Pacific sectors. The copper export revenue loss from the U.S. was already being offset by new Asian demand at higher prices. And because Canada had not imposed blanket bans or rhetoric-laced restrictions, its image remained stable, dependable, and business-friendly, exactly what riled investors were looking for. It wasn't just about copper anymore. It was about reputation. Canadian policy experts called it non-confrontational realignment. But Washington insiders had another name for it: abandonment. Canada had finally walked away from the U.S. orbit, not with fury, but with dignity. And Trump? He tweeted. He lashed out at ungrateful allies and globalist sellouts. He accused Carney of colluding with China. But no one was listening. Not in Brussels, not in Ottawa, and not even on Wall Street. The copper tariff had revealed the truth. American strength had become performative, its diplomacy transactional, and its economic policy short-sighted and self-sabotaging. By September, the situation reached a breaking point. Retailers in the U.S. began lobbying for exemptions. Hospitals reported delays in acquiring copper-based surgical tools. Clean energy projects, once hailed as Trump's infrastructure crown jewel, stalled en masse. The administration floated the idea of a 90-day tariff holiday, but it was too late. Canada had already moved on. Carney announced a multi-billion-dollar clean mineral fund to develop domestic smelting capabilities, ensuring that never again would Canada be beholden to a single partner for its economic lifeline. The fund attracted Japanese and German investment. Even India joined the framework, offering long-term copper purchasing guarantees. In Trump's vision, tariffs were weapons. In Carney's, they were warnings. The difference was profound. Back in Washington, the walls were closing in. What had begun as a bold political maneuver meant to flex economic muscle had spiraled into an economic and diplomatic disaster. Inside the White House, aides scrambled to justify the policy, blaming everything from Canadian trade dishonesty to illegal dumping of copper. But none of it stuck. Industry leaders knew the truth. Markets knew the truth. The American people were beginning to wake up to it too. Copper wasn't just a metal. It was the bloodstream of modern infrastructure. It ran through homes, cars, hospitals, military equipment, and clean energy grids. And with one signature, Trump had clogged that bloodstream, sending ripple effects across every vital system in the country. Meanwhile, Canada pressed forward, not with vengeance, but with vision. Mark Carney's government announced a Clean Minerals Acceleration Plan, $18 billion in targeted investments to make Canada a global leader in copper refining, sustainable mining, and next-gen smelting technologies. The plan wasn't just about responding to U.S. tariffs. It was about leapfrogging them entirely. If the U.S. wanted to shut Canada out, Canada would build its own stage and bring the rest of the world to it. South Korea and Germany were the first to sign joint R&D deals. Singapore followed. Even Australia, previously skeptical of Ottawa's long-term industrial policies, inked a multi-year bilateral minerals agreement. Canada had gone from supplier to orchestrator, turning its natural wealth into geopolitical leverage. In essence, they turned Trump's blockade into a launch pad. The effects were seismic. U.S. automakers, squeezed by copper shortages and rising costs, faced quarter after quarter of losses. Ford and GM both announced delayed EV rollouts in early 2026. Solar panel manufacturers, relying on copper wiring for energy transfer, laid off workers and shelved major domestic installations. Ironically, the American clean energy revolution, something Trump had tried to co-opt for political gain, was now being powered by Canadian exports to Asian buyers instead of to U.S. cities. And then came the political fallout. Polling from key battleground states revealed a surge in dissatisfaction among working-class voters. In Michigan, 61% of respondents blamed tariffs for rising prices and job delays in auto manufacturing. In Pennsylvania, a stunning 48% of Trump's 2024 voters said they were less likely to support him again if trade wars continued. The message was spreading. Protectionism without planning was a recipe for decline. Mark Carney, for his part, remained unshaken. In a widely viewed interview with the CBC, he said plainly, "We are not punishing America. We are protecting Canada." There's a difference. That quote reverberated across capitals from Berlin to New Delhi. Carney wasn't picking a fight. He was drawing a line. and the world respected him for it. In fact, what made Canada's retaliation so effective wasn't its aggression, it was its restraint. The retaliatory tariffs Canada did impose were razor-sharp, carefully selected to hit political pressure points in the U.S. without hurting ordinary people. Luxury goods, lobbyist-fueled agriculture, defense subcontractors, these were the targets. And Washington noticed. By late fall, pressure from American industries reached a fever pitch. Lobby groups launched ads against the tariff. Editorials from conservative-leaning newspapers began criticizing Trump's copper policy. Economists warned of a possible recession if retaliatory escalations continued into 2026. And yet, the administration doubled down, insisting the tariffs were about standing up to foreign manipulation. But there was no manipulation, only miscalculation. The copper tariff wasn't about national security. It wasn't about protecting American miners. It was about projecting strength. Unfortunately for Trump, it projected something else: weakness wrapped in arrogance.